Welcome to Whiskey 101. Today's lesson is how to nose your whiskey. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Hutch. I'm Steven, your host, and thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the world of whiskey. So today, we're trying out a slightly new format. I'm in a slightly new spot, and hopefully I've got queued up for you guys a blackboard, because what we're going to be talking about in this new series, which I'm calling Whiskey 101, is basically the basics of drinking, experiencing, and collecting whiskey. So we're going to start primarily with what goes into having a great whiskey sipping experience. So we'll probably get to some collecting aspects a little bit further down the line, but for now let's focus on how to have the best possible whiskey sipping experience. So we're going to be using today Buffalo Trace Bourbon as our sample, and that's because our topic today is how to nose your whiskey. So when it comes to the whiskey sipping experience, the first step, the first thing you're going to experience and do when you crack open a bottle is the nose. You're going to smell it. And I've heard the statistic, I'm sure you have too, that as much as like 80% of taste is what you smell. I think that's very true for bourbon and for whiskey in particular, but I think what it also does is sort of set the stage. The nose is the first feature, the first sort of act of a whiskey or bourbon, and you want to be on your game to really detect what's there. So I've got tips written down on my notes, which I'll be reading from, but I'll put them up on the blackboard as we go. So my very first tip for you is let your whiskey sit in the glass. So usually about 5 to 10 minutes of just sitting in the glass and opening up will help you have a much better experience on the nose. Something like Buffalo Trace, which is relatively low proof at 90 proof, that probably requires, again, that 5 to 10 minutes. If you got something more in the barrel strength range of 115 to 130 proof, I'd recommend maybe more like 15 minutes of letting it open up. Now, this isn't quite the same thing that you would hear in wine when we talk about letting a wine open up, because oxygen does slightly different things than it does to wine than it does to bourbon. But what it does help with is the ethanol sting. So whiskey is very high proof alcohol for most people, and allowing it to kind of come off the glass and have a little time to evaporate, which it will, can give you a lot more layers to the nose of your whiskey. So let it sit for about 5 to 10 minutes, and trust me, your experience is going to be a lot better. Okay, number 2 is when you nose a whiskey, you should keep your mouth slightly open as you breathe in through your nose. So something a lot of people maybe don't do when they first start out, and the reason again is ethanol. You don't want the ethanol vapors to get trapped in your nasal cavity, which they can, and that's actually what's causing that feeling of burning. So if you keep your mouth slightly open while you nose your whiskey, it allows those ethanol vapors to actually sort of have a place to go out and flow through. It will enhance your experience. It's a small adjustment you can make that will help you out a lot. Okay, tip number 3 is check your dominant nostril for the day. So, funny thing about the human body is you tend to actually have a dominant nostril that will switch at different times throughout the day from day to day. So some days your left nostril may actually be sort of the more dominant one that's allowing more aromas and even just more air. And then on the flip side, it could be your right nostril at other times. So while you're nosing your whiskey, just be mindful of that. Keep that in mind. For me today, I think it's my left side. It feels a little bit clearer, and I feel like I'm getting more of the distinct notes that I recognize from Buffalo Trace, and that's a big factor. So just keep that in mind. You can still smell out of both nostrils most of the time, but one will be more prominent than the other. Okay. So number 4 is where I'd like to spend the most amount of time, and that is go from general to specific. So this is one of my larger philosophies around the entire whiskey tasting, nosing experience. I have had so many people that I've introduced to bourbon and whiskey basically tell me they think they're never going to be able to pick anything up. Not going to have distinct notes in mind, not going to be able to talk about it at the level that I'm talking about it at. And they also then think, maybe I'm just making stuff up as I go, which I'll leave up to you to decide. But if you're new to whiskey, I'm hoping this series is very helpful for you. If you have been in the game for 10 plus years even, I hope this is a good refresher, and maybe this philosophy could still help you too. So, general to specific. It's actually a tip people use when they're writing. In a paragraph or an essay, you want to go from more general to specific. You want to start with a sort of a topic sentence and then, defend your argument throughout your paragraph. We'll apply it to whiskey. So everybody knows certain aromas. Everybody has enough experience to actually do this part of nosing a whiskey. So when I talk about general to specific, here's what I mean. So I'm going to smell this Buffalo Trace. Keeping my mouth a little bit open, not putting my nose all the way in there. That's another slight tip there. Keep it like just an inch or two away from the glass. And what I recognize is sweetness, right off the bat. Now, sweetness is about as general a category as you can give, but that's okay. Let's start with sweet. Then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of sweetness am I experiencing? So there's different forms of sweetness, right? There's sugary candy sweetness. There's fruity, citrusy sort of sweetness. And then there's a lot of the typical things you'll get on bourbon, which are like the brown sugar, vanilla, caramel kind of sweetness, candy bar sweetness. So you have to keep those broader categories in mind. And now we can take a step toward the more specific. So in terms of sweetness, what do I get? As I always tend to get on Buffalo Trace, I get a fruit sweetness as sort of the most prominent. So now I'm in the fruits world. Look at that. We went from maybe we don't know anything to we're identifying some fruit notes here. So what fruits? This is where we have to pull from our repertoire of smells to kind of grab a specific note. So for me, Buffalo Trace always has a cherry and grape experience on it. Both of those, most people have had cherries. Lots of people eat grapes on a daily basis. So if you can detect that, maybe a cherry juice, grape juice kind of experience, you've just gone from sweetness all the way down to cherry and grape. Now let's do that a little bit more. So another aspect I detect here is something in the brown sugar world. So it's more in that candy bar sweetness. And the way I would sort of narrow down here is what kind of candy bar? Definitely not nutty. Doesn't have any qualities like that for me. It's not really heavy either. It's more light. See how I'm using these general terms, but I'm starting to narrow in. Okay, so for me, this has like a lighter brown sugar and honey experience. So that's where I'd go with the sort of candy bar experience, a light brown sugar, and then maybe throw some honey in there as a particular note I'm feeling like a light caramel or honey kind of experience. So that is generally what I talk about when I talk about going from general to specific. You know enough to identify, is that sweet or is that spicy? Is that rich and dark or is that light and bright? Use those terms. Say them out loud. Give yourself sort of the time to identify the broad categories. And then over time, you'll get even better and better at kind of pulling out those very specific notes. And that leads me to tip number 5, which is smell stuff. So I know that's kind of funny, but the more you familiarize yourself with the aromas that are possible out there, the better you'll have a memory bank and a repertoire to pull from to specifically say, that's in this bourbon. So it's gonna sound a little bit strange, but actually take a moment to sort of smell the spices that are in your spice cabinet. When you do eat fruits, just become a little bit more aware of like, what does this actually smell like? When you're in the aisle at the grocery store and you see the spices, or you're in the baking aisle, kind of take note of some of those smells. And I think that will help you start to narrow down. And the better your memory bank, the more specific you can be. Because the truth is, you can't come up with a note you've never really smelled before. Now, here's something that's really interesting. Smell is very heavily linked to memory in the brain. So if you can form that association, it'll be really strong. And you will smell something. You'll smell a bourbon, you'll be like, that smells like orange citrus to me. Like 100%. You will feel the memory, you will feel that visceral kind of reaction, and it'll be cool. So build up that repertoire, learn and sort of catalog a memory bank of smells, be curious about it, and you'll become better and better at smelling your whiskey. Okay, so those are my top 5 tips. I think if you do all 5 of these, you'll be well on your way to mastering the art of nosing a whiskey. I did have one more to throw at you, sort of a bonus tip that I think can totally change the game for you, especially when you feel like you're getting a little bit stuck, or as your collection maybe starts to grow, you can experiment a little bit more. And that is using the power of comparison. So I've got another bourbon poured up. Let me pull that out now and we'll start talking. All right, so I've shifted things over a bit and pulled out Elijah Craig. So both of these bottles are similar in proof point. Elijah Craig's 94 proof, but they're very different profiles from very different distilleries that are known for different kinds of things. Buffalo Trace tends to be the more fruity, light, bright notes with some age. Elijah Craig and Heaven Hill tend to be a little bit more caramel, nut, darker, richer experiences. So let's visit the Buffalo Trace again. We're getting that bright cherry and honey, brown sugar, slight oak. Now, what happens when we go over to the Elijah Craig and allow ourselves to sort of experience the contrast? And it's just so immediate. The sweetness factor is very different here. How so? Well, for me, this leans much more into a deliberate caramel, almost processed sugar experience, like a marshmallow. It's got some layers of oak that it shares with the Buffalo Trace, but then you go back to the Buffalo Trace now. Give your nose just a second. Yeah, and I think what that drew out for me, kind of coming off of that, is this Buffalo Trace does have an oakiness to it, but it's very different. It's not as vanilla tannins, sugary oak. It's more of a roasty oak with that brown sugar, maybe a slightly drier oak, but then it's got the fruits coming through. I would actually say that the Elijah Craig is sweeter as the American nose or palate might detect it, just like those candy bar processed sugars. And the Buffalo Trace smells a little bit more like natural sweetness to me. Because yeah, this comes through with that marshmallow, caramel, oak experience. So that is a big help when you're either getting stuck or looking to develop more of an ability to pick out the differences. Lean into the art of comparison, lean into the power of putting two things side by side and really seeing how they're different. You'll be able to immediately say, oh, that one's lighter, that one's darker, that one's sweeter, that one's spicier. And that'll give you even more orientation as you nose your whiskey and your bourbon. Okay, everybody, that's going to wrap up our lesson today. I hope you find this series useful. Again, I do think it's going to be great for those who are beginning their whiskey journey, but those of you who have been doing this for a long time, probably a lot longer than me, maybe it's a good refresher and it'll help us all, master the fundamentals and continue to up our game. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the series and what episodes you would like to see come out in the series. What aspects of whiskey do you feel like we should break down or learn more about together? Thanks so much for joining me today. Hope you'll stick around and come to episode number 2, class number 2 here for Whiskey 101. Till I see you guys again for another video, all I can say is keep drinking good whiskey, keep learning about good whiskey, and cheers.